I was out hiking late one summer, the kind of day when the air feels thick and slow and the flies seem to swarm around every step you take. The trail wound through rolling farmland on the edge of the hills, with dry stone walls crumbling in places and patches of rough grass stretching between them. It wasn't deep wilderness, but it was quiet, almost too quiet. I remember the crunch of my boots on the gravel track and the faint hum of insects that never really stopped. The sheep were everywhere in the distance, little white shapes scattered across the green slopes, some grazing, some lying in the shade of scraggly hawthorn trees. They were just part of the landscape, something I barely paid attention to most of the time. But then I heard it. It wasn't the sound of wind or the usual bleating you'd expect from sheep. It was lower, broken, almost like a groan. I stopped walking, listening hard, my skin prickling at how out of place it sounded. At first I thought maybe one had gotten tangled in a fence or slipped into a ditch. The noise came again, thin and strained, and something about it pulled me toward it. I stepped off the track, into uneven ground where the grass grew tall and patchy. The buzzing of flies grew louder the further I went, until it was constant, thick in my ears. That's when I saw it. A sheep lay half hidden in a dip near the edge of a field, and even from a distance I could tell something was terribly wrong. Its wool wasn't the clean white or even the dirty gray-brown of the others. It was matted, clumped, and stained yellow and brown. The animal lay on its side, legs jerking weakly now and then, head rolling in little spasms. I froze. My first thought was disease. Then the smell hit me. It was sour and sharp, like rot and waste mixed together, strong enough that it made me gag. The air around the sheep shimmered with flies, a black, buzzing cloud that rose and fell in frantic bursts. They weren't just landing on it, they were swarming. I took a few hesitant steps closer, though everything in me wanted to back away. That's when I saw the wool move. At first I thought it was just the flies crawling over it. Then I saw the rippling, the tiny pale bodies pushing in and out of the filthy clumps. Maggots, hundreds of them. The sight made my stomach twist. They writhed over each other in wet, glistening mats, pushing deeper into the wool, into the flesh beneath. Where the wool had parted, I saw raw, red skin eaten away in patches, slick with moisture. The sheep bleated again, a thin, pitiful sound, and its dull eyes rolled toward me. I staggered back, nearly tripping. The buzzing seemed to grow louder, pressing in on me, clinging to my skin. The smell filled my nose and throat, heavy and sweet, the stench of something alive rotting while it still breathed. It was fly strike. I had heard of it before. Flies laying eggs in the damp wool of a sick or injured sheep, the larvae hatching and burrowing into the flesh, eating it alive. I'd never seen it. I wished I hadn't. The sheep's chest rose and fell in shallow, frantic bursts. Its legs twitched like it wanted to stand but couldn't. The maggots moved constantly, a living blanket of white against the filth of its wool. Flies landed on its eyes, its nose, crawling into its ears, feeding on the moisture. I stood there paralyzed. Part of me wanted to run, to get back to the safety of the trail, pretend I hadn't seen any of it. But I couldn't. Not with the sheep looking at me, not with that broken sound still in my ears. It was alive, and it was suffering in a way that made my chest ache just to watch. I had nothing useful with me, no way to treat it, no one to call. The farmhouses were miles back, and I hadn't seen another person all day. It was just me, the knife on my belt, and the awful reality that this animal wasn't going to survive. It would only keep suffering until something finally finished it. My hand shook as I reached for the knife. The idea of it felt wrong, but so did the idea of leaving it to rot alive. My throat was dry, my stomach knotted. The buzzing seemed to close in tighter as I crouched near the sheep. The smell was almost unbearable up close. The flies clung to my arms, my face, crawling at the sweat on my skin. I waved them off with one hand, gripping the knife with the other. The sheep let out another weak bleat, its eye rolling to meet mine. For a moment I couldn't move. It was like the whole world had narrowed to that dull eye and the crawling mass in its wool. I forced myself to act. My hand trembled, but I pressed the blade where it needed to go, quick and deep. The sheep jerked once, legs twitching hard, then went limp. The sound stopped. The buzzing didn't. I staggered back, breathing hard, wiping the blade in the grass with shaking hands. My stomach heaved, and I bent over, spitting, gagging at the smell that clung to me. The flies didn't stop. They swarmed the still body the same as before, crawling into the wounds, feeding as if nothing had changed. I couldn't look at it any longer. I turned and walked back toward the trail, every step heavy, my body shivering despite the heat. The buzzing stayed in my ears, the smell in my nose, the image burned behind my eyes. By the time I reached the track again, the sun felt harsher, the air hotter. My clothes stuck to me with sweat, and my chest still felt tight. I kept walking, faster than before, as if the distance could erase what I'd seen. But it stayed with me, every detail etched into my mind. The writhing wool, the pitiful sound, the weight of the knife in my hand. When I finally reached my car, I sat for a long time before starting the engine. My hands still shook, and I couldn't stop hearing the buzzing, couldn't stop smelling the rot. Even now, years later, I can't shake it. I still hike, but every time the flies swarm thick in summer, I remember that sheep lying in the grass, being eaten alive. That day reminded me that the countryside, as quiet and open as it seems, hides things that are brutal and merciless. Out there, suffering doesn't stop on its own. Sometimes it just drags on until someone stumbles across it and can't stomach walking away. And when you're the one standing there, the choice isn't clean. It's heavy, and it stays with you long after the buzzing fades. Years ago, I went hiking on a trail not too far from where I lived. It was the kind of place I went to often, somewhere I thought I knew well. The trail cut through thick woods and opened up into rocky ridges in certain spots, then dropped back down into narrow hollows where the trees grew close together and blocked most of the sky. I liked going there alone because it was quiet, and I could usually walk for hours without running into anyone else. That day, the air was cool but heavy, and everything felt damp. The leaves under my boots were slick from rain the night before, and the dirt stuck to the edges of the soles with each step. I had brought my dog with me. He was a large, strong dog who had always been steady on hikes. He was the kind of dog that never startled easily, never barked at squirrels or rustling bushes, and usually trotted right beside me with his head low, tongue hanging out and tail swaying lightly. He had been with me on trails before where we had crossed paths with deer, raccoons, and even snakes. He would look at them, sometimes perk up a little, but never tense in a way that worried me. That's why when his whole body suddenly went stiff, it caught my attention immediately. We had just come down a part of the trail where it bent around a hollow, and the trees were packed so tightly that the light barely got through. I was watching the ground carefully, because roots broke across the path and wet rocks were half buried in the mud. Out of nowhere, he stopped walking. His ears went straight up, his head snapped toward the right side of the trail, and a low growl rumbled out of his chest. At first, I thought maybe he had spotted a deer, but his growl wasn't the usual sound he made when he was just alert. This was deep, steady, and strange. I froze where I was listening. At first, I couldn't hear anything over his growl. Then, in the trees to our right, there was movement. Slow at first, like something shifting its weight, then a faint crack of a stick. My mind jumped to coyotes. We had seen them in the area before, though never close on the trail. They usually stayed back and slipped away if they saw people. But he had never reacted to them like this before. Even when we spotted one a few months back near an open field, he had only barked once and then calmed down. This time was different. His body was locked tight. The fur on his back stood up, and his growl only got lower and more steady. I squinted into the trees, trying to make out what was there. The woods were dense, a mess of branches and undergrowth, and I could only see maybe 20 feet in before the shadows swallowed everything. My heart began to pick up. I told myself it was a coyote, maybe two of them, but there was something in the way my dog's weight shifted that made me second guess. He wasn't just warning or being cautious. He was on edge in a way I had never seen. Then I caught the faint sound of footsteps, not quick or scattered like an animal's, but heavy and steady. The ground was damp, so each step had a faint squelch to it, mixed with the crunch of wet leaves. I strained to listen, and sure enough, it wasn't the darting movement of something small. It was slower, more deliberate. I stood perfectly still, hardly breathing, waiting to see if it would move closer. The sound stopped for a moment. My dog's growl deepened, and he took a step forward, muscles tight. His head held low like he was ready to spring if he had to. I felt my throat tighten, and a chill worked its way through me despite how warm my skin had gotten. Then I heard it again, the footsteps, but now angled, not straight toward us, more like they were circling, just inside the tree-line. I stayed frozen, not sure whether to keep going down the trail or turn back. I didn't like the idea of moving forward, but I didn't like the idea of turning around and giving whatever it was my back either. The woods were too thick to see, and I hated not knowing what was in there. My dog's breathing was heavy now, every inhale sharp and fast. He wasn't making any sudden moves, but I could feel his tension through the leash. I shifted my weight and tried to listen harder. The sound of movement came again, and this time I noticed how slow it was, like it was pacing us but deliberately keeping out of sight. Every few steps, there would be a pause, like it was waiting for me to react. I looked down at the trail, then back toward the trees, trying to catch even a glimpse of fur or movement, but I couldn't see anything. I told myself to keep walking. Standing still made me feel like a target. I tugged lightly on my dog's leash, and he reluctantly moved forward, still growling, still keeping his head turned toward the trees. My steps were slow and careful, every sound magnified in my ears, the squish of mud, the drag of wet leaves, the low hiss of my own breathing. The footsteps in the trees moved too, matching us, staying parallel. My chest tightened as the trail bent again and began to climb slightly. If I could just get to higher ground, I thought maybe I could see more clearly, maybe spot what was following us. I kept going, the sound of the pacing still steady to my right. My dog's body brushed against my leg as he pressed closer to me, his growl never letting up. Finally, when we broke into a thinner patch of trees, I stopped and turned to look back. The woods were quiet. The footsteps had stopped when I stopped. My dog stood rigid, staring into the shadows, ears still fixed forward. I stared as long as I could, my heart pounding in my ears, but nothing moved. No animal darted out, no person stepped forward. It was just silent. The silence made it worse. If it had been a coyote, I should have heard it run off when we started climbing. If it had been a deer, it would have bolted when my dog growled the first time. But it hadn't. It had stayed with us, pacing, slow and steady, just out of sight. I hated how deliberate it felt. I didn't wait any longer. I pulled my dog along and walked faster, keeping my head turned every few steps to check behind me. For the rest of the hike back, I never saw anything, but I felt it. Every rustle of leaves, every crack of a branch made my chest tighten, and my dog never fully relaxed until we broke out of the tree line and back into the open lot where I had parked. Only then did he finally ease, his tail loosening, his ears lowering, and the growl in his chest fading away. I stood there for a long moment with him, scanning the edge of the woods. Nothing moved. The trees stood still, and the trail looked empty, like we had imagined the whole thing. But I knew better. I had been out there plenty of times before, and I had never felt watched like that, never had him react that way. Driving home, I couldn't stop replaying it in my head. The slow, heavy steps, the way it kept its distance but stayed close enough that I knew it was there. I thought about coyotes again, but I knew it didn't fit. Coyotes don't follow like that, not slow and quiet and circling. My dog knew it too, and that's what unsettled me most. He wasn't scared of coyotes. He had been scared of whatever was in those woods that day. To this day, I still hike, but I don't go back to that trail alone anymore. Every time I think about it, I can still feel that same weight in my chest, like something was measuring me from the shadows, deciding whether to step closer or just let me walk out. The woods looked the same as always, but I knew from that moment on they weren't as empty as I once believed. It wasn't out on a trail or deep in the woods where this happened, but it has stuck in my head the same way some of those stories do. Back then, we lived in a neighborhood that was quiet enough during the day, but at night it changed. The streetlights were spaced far apart, some of them flickered, and most of the houses didn't have their porch lights on. There were long stretches of shadow between the pools of yellow light, and the wind always seemed to carry every small sound farther than it should. The creak of a gate, the rattle of a branch, the crunch of a footstep on gravel. It all traveled strangely. One night, we decided to take the dogs for their usual walk before heading in. We had 3 with us. 2 young ones with a lot of energy who always pulled hard, and the older one who had once been a service dog. He was calm, steady, and never aggressive. The worst he ever did was grab the ball from the younger dogs during fetch and refuse to let it go until he felt like it. He was the kind of dog you could trust around anyone. Because the younger 2 pulled so much, I usually walked them. I was ahead that night, maybe 10 or 15 feet, keeping my arms tight against the leash as they dragged me forward. My girlfriend walked the older dog behind me at her own pace. It wasn't unusual for her to lag a little since she liked to take her time, and the older dog wasn't in a rush. The sidewalks were cracked in places, tree roots pushing through and making the concrete uneven. I kept my eyes down for most of it, watching my step and keeping the younger dogs from tangling themselves up. We turned a corner where the street curved past a row of houses. I didn't notice much at first. I was too busy tugging at the leash and listening to the scuff of my shoes on the pavement. The dogs were pulling me toward another patch of light, eager for whatever smells were waiting. It wasn't until later that I found out what had made her slow down. There had been someone nearby. She had noticed him when I had gone ahead. He was standing near one of the houses, not on the sidewalk, but close enough that it looked odd. It was late enough at night that anyone outside should have stood out, but she thought maybe he lived there. The thing that bothered her was the way he moved. She told me later it seemed like he was looking too closely at the place, his eyes running over the windows, the yard, like he was checking it out instead of just passing by. I hadn't seen him because of the way the corner curved, but she had, and it made her uneasy. She didn't want to draw attention to herself, so she just kept walking slowly. The older dog, the calm one, was at her side, and she figured there wasn't much to worry about. But as she walked, he suddenly stiffened, and his head turned sharply toward the man. Then, without any warning, he let out a low growl. That dog never growled. He had spent years trained to stay calm no matter what happened around him. He had been through crowds, loud noises, even aggressive dogs, and he never once lost his composure. But that night, he growled in a way that made her whole body tense. It wasn't loud at first, just a steady rumble, but it was clear and unshakable. I didn't hear it because I was too far ahead. All I knew at the time was that when I slowed a little to check behind me, she was walking faster than usual, trying to close the gap between us. She had the leash pulled tight, and the older dog's head was still locked in the direction of the man. His body was tense, the fur along his back standing up. She caught up to me quickly, her steps sharp on the pavement, and she didn't relax until we were back under the next streetlight together. The whole walk after that felt different. I could feel her unease in the way she stuck closer, and I noticed how the older dog stayed alert even though he was normally the most relaxed one. He didn't growl again, but he kept glancing back, ears high, as if making sure we weren't being followed. The younger dogs seemed to pick up on it too because even they stopped tugging as much, and their tails weren't swinging loosely the way they usually did. We didn't linger on the rest of the walk. Usually, we let the dogs sniff around in the grass near the corner lots, or we'd loop the neighborhood twice to give them more exercise. That night, we cut it short. We went straight back, the sound of our shoes on the pavement quick and even. I glanced behind us more than once, my eyes straining in the gaps between the streetlights, half expecting to see someone there. The shadows seemed to stretch longer than normal, and every small noise made me twitch. When we got home, she told me everything. The way the man had been standing near the house, the way he had looked, and the moment the older dog growled. What struck me most was that the dog had reacted before she could. He had sensed something in that man, something off, and it made my stomach turn. If it had just been her instinct, I might have brushed it off as nerves. But the dog, he was the steady one, the one I trusted to stay calm in any situation. For him to growl, and not just a bark of surprise, but a deep, steady growl that said everything. After that night, our walks changed. We still took the dogs out, but we stuck closer together. I didn't go ahead with the younger two while she lagged behind anymore. We walked in a tight group, side by side, especially around corners and in darker stretches. We started bringing a flashlight, even when the streetlights were on. I found myself scanning every shadow, every yard, checking windows and porches, trying to see if anyone was standing there. The memory of that moment never really faded. It was simple, nothing happened, no one followed us home, and we never saw the man again. But it was the way the dog reacted that stayed with me. That growl had come from somewhere deep, an instinct he couldn't ignore, and it told me more than anything else could. I knew then that there are moments where you don't get the luxury of brushing things off. You have to pay attention because sometimes the difference between safe and not safe is just that small decision. To take something seriously, to keep moving, to not assume it's nothing. Looking back now, I know it could have been worse. If she had been alone, if the dog hadn't been there, if the man had decided to step forward instead of standing where he was, it all could have gone differently. But it didn't. We got home fine, shaken but unharmed. And from that night on, I trusted the dog's instincts as much as my own. That walk taught me that even in familiar places, under streetlights in a neighborhood you think you know, unease can creep in without warning. You don't need to be deep in the woods or far from home to feel that sudden cold weight in your chest. Sometimes it happens right outside your door when you least expect it. I had taken my dog out on plenty of hikes before, so when I set out that morning, I wasn't expecting anything unusual. The sky was overcast, but not in a threatening way, just gray and heavy like it couldn't decide whether it wanted to rain or not. The air smelled damp, a mix of wet earth and fallen leaves that had been sitting for days. It was one of those quiet mornings where the forest feels hushed, like the air itself is thick enough to absorb sound. The trail wasn't a new one for me, but it wasn't the most popular route either. That was part of the reason I chose it. I wanted space, just me and my dog, with the steady rhythm of our steps and the occasional bird call. My dog, a shepherd mix, was always alert on hikes but never jumpy. He had a way of keeping his nose low and ears pricked, stopping now and then to sniff at something before trotting along again. Usually, he walked a few paces ahead of me, tail relaxed, turning back every so often to check in. That morning started no differently. We crossed a small footbridge, followed the dirt path up a steady incline, and wove through stands of tall pines and bare hardwoods. The ground was soft with needles and half-rotted leaves. I remember noticing the prints of deer in a patch of mud and thinking about how often animals moved through the area when people weren't around. The first few miles passed in that peaceful rhythm. I felt my breathing even out, my mind clearing with each step. Then, somewhere deeper along the trail, the tone shifted. There wasn't anything obvious about it at first. The trees were the same. The path was the same, narrow, winding, with undergrowth brushing the sides. The light hadn't changed much, just the same muted gray filtering through the branches. But my dog slowed. At first, I thought he had picked up the scent of an animal. He stiffened, nose twitching, his pace dropping until he was right at my side. Then, with no warning, he gave a short bark, sharp and loud in the stillness. I stopped. I scanned the woods, turning my head left and right, peering between trunks and brush. Nothing moved. Not a squirrel, not a bird, not the flick of a deer tail. The forest looked empty, but my dog didn't relax. His hackles rose, the fur standing up in a ridge along his spine. He barked again, then snarled, a low rumble that I rarely heard from him unless another dog was getting too close in a threatening way. His body was rigid, his tail stiff. I tried to see what he saw, but there was nothing out of place. Just the quiet woods, the trail ahead, the damp leaves, the same as always. The longer I stood there, the more I realized how silent it had gotten. No wind stirred the branches. No birds called. I could hear my own breathing, shallow and uneven now, and the growl in my dog's chest. Then, just as suddenly, he tucked himself behind me. He pressed his body against the back of my legs, trembling. His ears were pinned back, and every few seconds he'd dart forward with a bark and snarl, only to retreat again and cower behind me. That behavior chilled me more than anything I could have seen. I had never known him to be a cowardly dog. He wasn't reckless, but he didn't spook easy. Seeing him oscillate between aggression and fear, as if he was trying to stand his ground against something he couldn't face, sent a cold wave through me. I kept sweeping my eyes across the woods, my hand tightening on the strap of my backpack, but the world stayed still. Nothing stirred. We stood there longer than I wanted to admit. My legs began to ache from keeping so rigid. Every nerve in my body screamed that something was wrong, even if I couldn't see it. The woods didn't look different, but they felt different. My dog's behavior magnified that feeling until it pressed down on me like weight. The decision to move wasn't even a decision. It was instinct. I wanted to get away from that stretch of trail, away from whatever was upsetting him. I urged us forward, trying to keep a steady pace. My dog stayed close to me now, no longer ranging ahead like he usually did. He kept looking over his shoulder, ears twitching at sounds I couldn't hear. Every so often he'd give a sudden bark, sharp and desperate, as if warning something to stay back. Each time, my heart hammered harder. The trail felt longer than it ever had before. Every bend, every shadowed cluster of trees felt like a place something could be watching. I remember how tightly I gripped the straps of my pack, my shoulders hunched, my steps quick. I didn't run, but I wanted to. The forest floor seemed louder under my boots, every crunch of leaves and snap of a twig echoing. I couldn't shake the sense that the quiet wasn't natural. Normally, when I walked these trails, I'd hear life all around me. The chatter of birds, the rustle of small animals. Here, there was only silence and the sound of my dog alternating between growls and whimpers. The trail eventually dipped into a hollow where the air was cooler and the ground softer with mud. I could see where deer had passed recently, but that should have comforted me. Instead, the sight made me think about predators. My mind ran through possibilities. A bear bedded down somewhere close, a mountain lion, maybe even a person hiding out where they shouldn't be. The thought of someone crouched in the trees watching me was almost worse than the idea of an animal. I kept glancing back, convinced I would see movement, but each time the trail behind me was empty. My dog refused to walk in the back, though. He stayed at my side, brushing against me with every step. His breathing was quick, shallow, almost panting though it wasn't hot. He was scared in a way that I couldn't dismiss. The longer we moved, the more desperate I felt to get out of there. I wasn't just hiking anymore. I was retreating. I checked my watch over and over, tracking how far we had left before we'd be near the trailhead. Every minute stretched. I started counting my steps to keep from letting panic take over. 100 steps, then another 100. I told myself to focus on the ground, on the motion, not the shadows pressing in from the trees. When we finally reached the last half mile, something shifted. My dog's posture loosened. He still glanced behind us, but his tail lifted slightly, and his steps grew less frantic. The oppressive stillness eased. I could hear a woodpecker somewhere in the distance, and the sound, simple as it was, felt like a relief. It was the first sign of normal forest life in what felt like forever. By the time we broke through the trees near the parking lot, my legs were trembling with adrenaline and fatigue. I looked back one last time at the stretch of trail we'd left behind. It looked ordinary, just like it had before. Damp dirt, tall trees, undergrowth. Nothing out of place. But I knew I'd never forget how it felt when my dog had lost his confidence there. When he alternated between defiance and terror at something I couldn't perceive. I drove home in silence, my dog curled tight in the back seat, still watchful but calmer. Even after hours passed, I couldn't shake the unease. I replayed the scene over and over, trying to come up with a rational explanation. The closest I could settle on was that something had been there. Something hidden, something that didn't want to be seen. Whether it was an animal or a person, I'll never know. What I do know is that I trust my dog's instincts more than my own eyes now. Whatever he sensed on that trail was real enough to him, and that was enough for me. I haven't gone back to that part of the woods since. Some places might look ordinary, but the silence and the reaction of an animal that knows better can tell a different story. That stretch of trail will always stay in my mind as the place where nothing looked wrong, but everything felt wrong, and that was enough to send me running. When I think back on it now, it's hard to wrap my head around the fact that I was only 7 years old. At that age, I had no business being out in the woods without an adult, but kids don't really think about things like that. At 7, you just go with whatever seems fun in the moment. The woods behind my neighborhood had always been this mysterious place to me. A green wall of trees that stretched out farther than my eyes could follow, and I wanted to see what was in there. Felt like an adventure waiting to happen. That day started off like any other summer day. I woke up late, ate a bowl of cereal while watching cartoons, and wandered around the house looking for something to do. It was hot outside, the kind of sticky heat that makes the pavement shimmer, and I was restless. That's when one of the kids from my street came over, talking big about how he knew all the trails in the woods. He made it sound like he'd been out there 100 times, like he could walk those trails blindfolded and still find his way back. At 7 years old, confidence like that is convincing. I believed him because I wanted to believe him. The idea of spending the afternoon exploring sounded a lot better than staying inside and being bored. So, I went to my mom and told her we were going for a short hike. I promised we wouldn't be gone long, maybe an hour or two at most. I told her my friend knew the way. She wasn't happy about it, but eventually she agreed, warning me not to go too far. We left our street and walked down the narrow dirt path that led into the woods. The trees swallowed us up quickly, the air cooler under the shade, the smell of leaves and damp dirt heavy all around us. First, it was exciting. The sunlight filtered through the branches in patches. Birds chirped overhead, and everything felt alive and full of energy. My friend walked ahead, pointing out turns and little side paths, acting like a tour guide. For the first hour, it felt like nothing could go wrong. We followed trails that twisted and curved, sometimes narrowing so much that we had to step carefully over roots and rocks. I wasn't worried at all. The woods felt safe in the middle of the day, with sunlight still high above. I thought we'd just loop around and end up back where we started. But then the trail we were on began to fade. The dirt path wasn't as clear anymore. We kept walking, thinking it would connect to another one, but it didn't. Instead, the ground evened out into a blanket of leaves, with no clear direction to follow. My friend slowed down, glancing around, but he didn't say anything about being lost. He just kept walking like he still knew where he was going. I followed him because I didn't know what else to do. That was when things began to change. The longer we walked, the less familiar everything looked. Every tree looked the same. Every stretch of ground felt identical. I realized after a while that I had no idea which direction we had come from. When I turned around, the woods stretched out behind us, endless and empty, no trail in sight. My stomach knotted up, but I tried to push it down. I didn't want to admit yet that we might be lost. After another hour of wandering, though, there was no denying it. We had no idea where we were. My chest tightened with panic. I tried to remember the way back, but all the details blurred together. I couldn't retrace our steps, and the more I tried to think about it, the more hopeless it seemed. We decided to just keep moving because standing still felt worse. Every few minutes, I'd glance up at the sky through the gaps in the trees, trying to figure out the time by the sunlight. At first, it was still high, bright, and golden. But slowly, the shadows started to stretch longer, and the sunlight lost some of its heat. I felt my fear grow heavier with each passing minute. My legs started to ache. My mouth was dry. We hadn't brought water or food. We were only supposed to be gone for an hour or two. That realization hit me hard. We weren't prepared for this at all. I started to picture what it would be like if we had to spend the night out there. My imagination ran wild with images of wild animals, of cold darkness, of never finding our way out. I thought about my mom at home, expecting me back, maybe pacing by the window, maybe already worrying why I wasn't there yet. By the time the sun began to dip lower, I was sure we were doomed. The light took on that orange glow of late afternoon, the kind of light that warns you the day is almost over. The trees looked different in that light, darker, more twisted. Every sound made me jump. A branch snapping somewhere far off made my heart race. I felt like the woods were closing in, like we were smaller and smaller with every step we took. The panic finally hit me full force. My throat burned, my chest ached, and I felt tears sting my eyes. I was convinced I was never going to make it home. I thought about my mom again, about how she would react. She was strict, yes, but she loved me fiercely. I could picture her face when she realized I was missing, the way her worry would twist into anger if I ever did come back. The thought made me feel even worse. We kept walking, aimlessly, and just when I thought we couldn't go on any longer, we saw movement ahead. At first, I froze, terrified it might be an animal. But then I saw a man walking toward us along a faint trail, carrying a small backpack. He looked surprised to see two kids in the middle of the woods, but he didn't seem alarmed. He had a folded map in his hand, and he asked us where we had come from. We told him about our neighborhood, and he nodded, saying he knew where that was. He said he was heading back that way anyway. Following him felt like stepping out of a nightmare. His movements were steady, confident, nothing like our frantic wandering. He walked with purpose, and for the first time in hours, I felt like we were going to be okay. The light continued to fade, slipping into the gray of early evening, but it didn't matter anymore. We were on a path that led somewhere, and someone else was in charge. When we finally broke out of the trees and saw the houses of our neighborhood, I nearly collapsed from relief. The sight of those rooftops against the darkening sky was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. But my relief didn't last long. When I walked into my house, my mom was waiting for me. Her face was pale, her arms crossed, her eyes sharp with a mix of fear and fury. She hadn't called the cops yet, but only because she was on the verge of doing so. And honestly, in that moment, I almost wished she had. If the police had been involved, maybe she would have been less focused on me. Instead, all that pent-up fear she'd been feeling came out as pure anger. I stood there, dirty and exhausted, trying to process the fact that I was safe while also bracing myself for the storm. My mom didn't yell right away, but the silence was worse. I knew I had terrified her. I knew I had broken her trust. And I knew that if anyone was going to make me regret that day even more than the woods already had, it was her. Looking back now, I realized just how close it all was to ending very differently. If we hadn't run into that man, if we had kept wandering just a little longer, the sun would have set completely. Two scared 7-year-olds alone in the dark woods. Who knows what would have happened? Maybe we'd have made it through the night, maybe not. That thought still chills me. I learned a lot that day. I learned how quickly confidence can turn into panic, how easily a fun adventure can twist into something terrifying. I learned that the woods don't care how old you are, and they don't forgive mistakes. And most of all, I learned that my mom's anger, as scary as it was in the moment, came from a place of fear and love. She didn't call the cops, but if I'd been gone much longer, she would have. Even now, I can still feel the fear of those endless trees, the way the light faded, the way my heart sank with every step. I can still picture the relief of seeing the houses again, and the dread of seeing my mom waiting inside. That day has stuck with me ever since, a memory burned into my mind, and I've never underestimated the woods again. It was late, far later than I usually ever went out for a jog, but I had felt restless that night. The clock had already passed 1 in the morning when I laced up my shoes and stepped out. The streets in the neighborhood were empty and quiet, with only the occasional hum of a faraway car drifting through. The air was cool, heavy with that damp smell that always settles after the heat of the day has gone. Streetlights gave off a weak glow, some of them flickering, leaving stretches of shadow between the pools of light. Jogging at that hour had a strange feel to it. Everything seemed both familiar and foreign at the same time. I knew the layout of the neighborhood well, but in the dark, with so many windows blacked out and driveways empty, it felt like I was moving through a different place. My shoes slapped against the pavement rhythmically, and my breathing was steady but heavier than usual from the humid air. Every sound I made seemed to echo off the houses, and every crack in the sidewalk felt more noticeable. After a while, I slowed down. Sweat clung to the back of my neck, and my chest rose and fell with sharp breaths. I stopped under a streetlight near one of the houses and leaned forward slightly, resting my hands just above my knees while I caught my breath. The neighborhood was silent. No one else out, no dogs barking in the distance, not even the sound of crickets, just silence. As I straightened back up, something in my peripheral vision caught my eye. To the right of me was one of the driveways, and there was movement. I turned my head and froze when I saw him. A man was crouched low beside the driver's side of a neighbor's car. He wasn't moving much, just huddled close, almost hugging the side of the vehicle. His posture immediately struck me as strange. People don't usually crouch like that next to someone else's car. Not at 1 in the morning. We locked eyes. For a long second, we just stared at each other, neither of us moving. The yellow glow from the streetlight didn't fully reach him, but I could make out the way his shoulders hunched and how his hands shifted awkwardly near the car door. His expression wasn't threatening, but it was nervous, almost caught off guard, like he hadn't expected anyone to be there. My first thought was to keep moving, but my legs felt locked in place. My mind tried to make sense of it. Maybe he was the owner of the car, maybe he dropped something, maybe he was just checking something on the side. But the longer I looked, the less it felt like that. His crouch was too low, too deliberate, and there was something about the way he stared back at me that unsettled me. The silence stretched. The cool night air suddenly felt heavier, pressing in around me, my own heart beat loud in my chest. I couldn't shake the sense that I had interrupted something. I finally forced myself to breathe, stood straighter, and walked forward again. My pace wasn't fast, but it wasn't slow either. I just wanted distance between me and that driveway. The whole time I moved past, I could feel his eyes on me. I didn't dare turn my head again, but I knew he was watching. My skin prickled, and every instinct screamed that I needed to keep moving, not stop, not look back. When I rounded the corner, I finally let myself exhale. My breathing was ragged again, though not from the jogging anymore. My hands trembled slightly, and I tried to shake it off. I told myself he probably wasn't doing anything wrong, that maybe it was his car, that maybe I had just been paranoid because of the time of night. But deep down, I knew what I had seen. He had been crouched by that car, his body tucked in tight to avoid being seen. That wasn't the posture of someone who belonged there. I kept jogging, but the rhythm was gone. Every shadow seemed deeper, every sound sharper. A tree branch moving in the wind made me jolt, and when a car drove by on a distant street, my nerves spiked again. I couldn't get the image out of my head, the way he had frozen, the way we had stared at each other like two people caught in a place they weren't supposed to be. By the time I got back to my house, I was wound tight. I stood at the door for a moment, listening to the quiet, scanning the street to see if anyone else was out. Everything looked still, like it had before, but I couldn't shake the unease. I went inside, locked the door behind me, and stood for a long time in the dark living room, replaying it in my head. Later, lying in bed, the realization came down heavier. The way he crouched, the awkwardness, the nervous look, it all pointed to one thing. He hadn't been there for any normal reason. He had been trying to break into the neighbor's car, and I had stumbled right into the middle of it. At the time, my mind hadn't wanted to admit it, but the signs were clear. And what chilled me most was how easily it could have gone differently. If I had stopped longer, if I had spoken to him, if he had panicked and lashed out, it could have been a lot worse than just an uneasy moment. Being alone at 1 in the morning with no one else around, I had been exposed without even realizing it. The only thing that had kept it from escalating was the silence we both chose, the unspoken agreement to move on and not push the moment further. Since then, I've thought about it every time I consider going out that late again. The neighborhood looks safe during the day, familiar and harmless. But in the dark, with the houses asleep and the streets empty, it's different. Things happen in those hours that don't happen when the sun is up, and you notice things you wouldn't see otherwise. That night taught me more than I wanted to know about how quickly normal can turn unsettling. I never went jogging at 1 in the morning again. I stuck to the daylight, when the sidewalks felt alive with people and the shadows didn't seem so heavy. The thought of running into something like that again, alone in the silence, was enough to keep me inside until the sun came up. Looking back, I'm grateful nothing happened beyond that stare. It was over in minutes, but the weight of it lasted far longer. Even now, when I pass that stretch of street in the daylight, I remember the driveway, the crouched figure, and how the night suddenly didn't feel so empty anymore. I had the idea one night to drive up into the mountains and go for a night hike. It wasn't the smartest decision, but at the time it felt exciting, like one of those impulsive things you do just to shake yourself awake a little. The roads were quiet, barely any traffic, and as I climbed higher, the air grew cooler, thinner, and carried that sharp pine scent that always lingers in mountain air. The farther I drove, the darker it became. Out there, away from the city lights, the stars stretched across the sky in a way they never did back home. It should have felt freeing, but something about the silence pressed against me. I pulled into a small dirt lot near the trailhead. I had been there before during the day, so I knew the layout. There was space for maybe a dozen cars, but that night it was completely empty. Not one vehicle, no hikers, no campers, just me, my headlights spilling across the gravel and catching on the outline of the trail sign. I kept the car idling, the engine humming low. Even before I shut it off, the unease started creeping in. It wasn't anything I saw or heard, just a sudden awareness, a prickling at the back of my neck, that feeling you get when you're being watched. The parking lot was small and open. From where I sat, I could see most of it, along with the tree-line that pressed in tight around the lot. Nothing moved, but I couldn't shake the thought that someone was nearby. I told myself it was paranoia. It was late, dark, and I was alone. Of course my mind was going to play tricks on me, but the longer I sat there, the worse it got. My hand hovered near the key, debating whether I should even bother turning the engine off. For whatever reason, I glanced to my right. That's when I saw it. On top of a small bump of a hill about 50 feet away was a shape. First, I thought it was a tree. It stood perfectly still, long and narrow against the night sky. I squinted through the window, trying to make sense of it. The outline looked wrong though, uneven in a way no tree trunk usually is. The longer I looked, the more my stomach twisted. Then it moved. The arms shifted, slowly, deliberately, hanging down by its sides. There was no wind, not even the faintest breeze, so I knew then it wasn't a tree. It was a person standing still, watching me. I froze in place, my breath catching in my throat. My headlights didn't fully reach the figure, so it stayed in shadow, but I could see enough to know it was facing my direction. The stillness of its body was what unsettled me most. It wasn't pacing, it wasn't fidgeting. It was standing perfectly rigid, like it didn't want to be noticed, like it had been waiting there. My mind started racing. Why would someone be standing there in the dark, 50 feet from an empty parking lot, motionless, staring at a car that just pulled in? There were no other cars around, no signs of campers or hikers. Whoever it was hadn't moved toward me, hadn't called out, hadn't done anything but stand there, waiting. I couldn't stop picturing what would happen if I stepped out of the car. I imagined myself walking toward the trail, the sound of my boots crunching on the gravel, while that figure stayed still until I turned my back. Then it would move. Then it would follow. The thought made my skin crawl. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel. The car engine was still running, my headlights throwing pale light across the lot. My gut screamed at me not to turn the car off, not to make myself vulnerable. I stayed like that for several long seconds, staring at the figure, waiting to see if it would step down the hill. Didn't. It just stayed there, still as stone. But the fact that it hadn't moved toward me didn't make me feel safer. It made me feel worse, because it meant it was waiting for something, maybe for me to open the door, maybe for me to step out and leave the safety of the car. That was enough for me. I put the car into reverse, my hands trembling slightly as I backed out of the lot. My headlights shifted, briefly sweeping across the hill. For a split second, I saw the faintest glint, like light reflecting off eyes or something metallic. Then the shape vanished back into the shadow as my headlights angled away. I didn't stop to look again. I pressed harder on the gas and pulled back onto the road, my eyes flicking between the rearview mirror and the stretch of pavement ahead. Every dark corner, every pull-off, every break in the tree line looked like a place someone could step out. My pulse hammered in my ears the whole drive down, and I didn't relax until I reached the first cluster of streetlights at the edge of town. When I finally parked back at home, I sat in the car for a while, my hands still tight on the wheel. I kept replaying the image in my mind, the tall, rigid figure, the way the arms shifted, the silence of it. Whoever that was, they weren't just out for a walk. People don't stand on hillsides at 1 in the morning, in complete silence, staring at empty parking lots. The realization sank in hard. If I had gotten out of the car, I would have been stepping straight into whatever plan that person had. Alone, in the dark, in the middle of the mountains with no one else around. No one would have heard anything. No one would have known I was even there. Since that night, I've never gone hiking in that park after dark. Even when friends suggest it, even when the idea of stargazing or night hikes comes up, I shut it down. The risk isn't worth it. That one moment in the parking lot made it clear to me how quickly things can turn. The mountains, the woods, they always feel different at night. But that night taught me that it isn't just the dark or the silence that makes them unsettling. Sometimes it's the people who choose to stand in those shadows, waiting, hoping you'll step out into the dark with them. I'll never forget how close I came to doing just that. If I hadn't trusted the pit in my stomach, if I had brushed off that feeling as paranoia, I might have walked straight into the kind of danger you don't walk away from. I left that night and I haven't gone back since. And I know now, without a doubt, that I never will. I wasn't hiking when this happened, but I think it's worth telling anyway because the memory of it has never left me. It was one of those nights where the world feels quieter than usual, and every detail sticks in your mind. It was around 3 in the morning, and I was driving home from a friend's house just outside the city. Normally, the road I took was packed during the day. 4 lanes of cars moving constantly, horns blaring, lights flashing. But at that hour, it was empty. Not just quiet, but completely still in a way that makes you notice how alone you really are. The air was warm but heavy, and my windows were cracked just a little to let in the smell of damp earth and asphalt that had cooled from the day's heat. The road stretched ahead under the glow of tall streetlights, but the further I went, the fewer lights there were. By the time I reached the wooded stretch, the lamps were spaced so far apart that they only cast pools of dim yellow light, leaving long gaps of shadow between them. That part of the road always felt a little different, even in the daytime, because it dipped slightly downhill and passed under a bridge. On both sides, thick trees pressed up close, their branches leaning over the guardrails like they were reaching into the road. It was as I came over a rise that I first saw something. At first, it was just a shape small against the black ribbon of road. I thought maybe it was an animal, like a stray dog or a deer, since I'd seen those before at night. I slowed down, letting my headlights stretch farther ahead, until the shape became clear. It wasn't an animal at all. It was a person. A woman stood directly in the middle of my lane, perfectly still. Her body faced me head-on, like she had been waiting. As I got closer, I could make out her hair, matted and tangled, hanging in uneven strands around her face. Her clothes looked torn and dirty, hanging loosely off her frame like they hadn't been washed in weeks. She didn't wave for help or try to move aside. She just stood there, facing my car as I crept closer. That was already unsettling enough, but then I noticed her mouth. At first it looked like she was holding something, but as my headlights hit her more directly, I realized she had a cluster of sticks in her teeth. Not 1 or 2, but a whole bundle of twigs and small branches, clutched between her jaws so tightly that they stuck out on both sides of her face. Her lips were pulled back, her teeth locked on the wood, and her jaw muscles looked strained from holding them. Her eyes were wide open, bulging almost unnaturally, fixed right on my car as if she'd been waiting for it to appear. The sight of her hit me harder than I expected. Even though I was inside a moving car, I felt a jolt of fear that made me let out a quick noise, half gasp, half scream. The image was so strange, so out of place, that it didn't even register properly in my head at first. It wasn't like she was injured or asking for help. It was like she had chosen to stand there, in that position, with that disturbing expression, in the middle of an empty road at 3 in the morning. I slowed almost to a stop, not sure what to do, and then instinct took over. I eased into the next lane, planning to just pass her safely and keep going. But the second I moved, she moved too. Not just a shuffle or a stagger, but a sudden, purposeful lunge toward the direction of my car. Her legs jerked forward fast, as if she was trying to put herself in front of me, like she wanted me to hit her. I swerved quickly, cutting across another lane to give her a wide berth. My tires hummed against the lines of the road, my heart racing, and I sped past her as fast as I could. In my side vision, I saw her head whip toward me, those wide eyes following my car. For a split second, I thought she was about to dive at the vehicle, but then she stayed behind, standing under the glow of the nearest streetlight, her figure shrinking in my rearview mirror. The twigs still stuck grotesquely out of her mouth as she stared after me. I gripped the wheel tighter than I ever had, forcing myself to keep going straight. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to drive faster, to put as much distance as possible between myself and whatever I had just seen. But the fear didn't vanish when she was out of sight. It lingered, crawling under my skin, leaving me shaken in a way that wild animals on the road never had. This was different. This was a person, and her behavior hadn't made any sense. The road stretched on in silence, no other headlights approaching, no sign of life anywhere. I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting to see that black silhouette sprinting after me, but the asphalt behind me stayed empty. The rest of the drive felt like it took an eternity. I kept the speedometer just a little higher than usual, eyes fixed on the dark road, my stomach in knots. When I finally pulled into the lot of my apartment building, I parked faster than normal, cutting the engine and sitting in silence for a moment. The world outside the car seemed darker than usual. I had to cross from my parking spot to my building, just a short walk, but it felt like a mile. Every shadow along the path looked like it could hold a figure. My heart pounded in my ears as I locked the car and forced myself to walk briskly, my keys clutched tight in my fist. The hallway light inside my building felt blinding compared to the darkness outside. Once I shut the door to my apartment behind me, I leaned against it, breathing hard. The image of her face wouldn't leave my head. Those twigs jutting out, her jaw clamped down, her eyes stretched wide as she watched me. It wasn't like anything I'd ever seen before, not in real life. I never reported it, though sometimes I wonder if I should have. Maybe she needed help. Maybe something was seriously wrong. But the way she moved toward my car, quick and deliberate, told me that if I had stopped or gotten out, things could have gone a lot worse. That night changed the way I think about being out late. The road I took was one I'd driven hundreds of times without a second thought. But now, every time I pass that wooded stretch under the bridge, I feel myself tensing up, eyes scanning the lanes like I expect to see her there again. She never showed up after that night, but the memory still lingers, and I doubt it will ever go away. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't some trick of the dark. It was a person standing out there in the middle of the road at 3 a.m, doing something that made no sense at all. And somehow, that makes it the most disturbing encounter I've ever had. It started as a typical summer night with some friends. We had planned to meet at a lake not too far from town for a campfire. Of course, copious amounts of alcohol were involved. It was supposed to be a fun, relaxed evening. Music, laughter, beers, the whole deal. I got to the spot a little later than some of the others, but the others were already struggling a bit. The road in was barely a road, more of a dirt track, and when we got there, we found a barricade. Someone had clearly tried to keep people out. We drove around it carefully, but as soon as we hit a particularly soft patch, one of the cars got stuck in the mud. While everyone was pushing and trying to get the tires spinning without digging ourselves in deeper, I glanced around at the dark trees, the shadowed lake just visible through breaks in the foliage, the thick brush pressing against the narrow dirt path. I made a joke, loud enough to cut through the grunts and shouts, something about how this was exactly how a horror movie would start. Everyone laughed, and for a moment it was funny. Cars stuck, mud everywhere, the smell of wet earth and gas and alcohol mixing in the warm night air. We finally managed to get the car free, tires slipping but eventually gaining traction, and continued on to the lake. The scene was perfect in that way that only late-night drinking trips in the woods can be. The fire was built, logs stacked, flames licking the air. Music from a small portable speaker filled the clearing with a low, steady thrum. Drinks were flowing, people were laughing and joking, passing bottles back and forth, telling stories that got louder and more ridiculous as the night went on. Then, out of nowhere, this guy just walked out of the woods. He wasn't running or shouting, just casually walking, a beer in his hand like he was invited. At first, I froze, instinctively scanning for any kind of threat. My gut hit the alarm button immediately. I don't know why exactly. There was nothing about his clothes or his appearance that screamed danger at first glance, but everything about the situation screamed danger to me. My friends waved him over, laughing at my sudden tension. Of course, I'm the one who watches too many scary movies, they said. Relax, they said. The guy ended up sitting down a few feet away from me. I didn't move closer, didn't try to chat, just kept my eyes casually on him while keeping one hand near the cooler for the beers. And then I saw it, the hatchet someone had brought for firewood sitting beside the cooler. A little rational part of me knew it was just a tool, but the rest of me decided I wasn't going to be caught off guard. I grabbed it, resting the handle across my lap, edged down, feeling its weight and comfort in my hands. That's when he made his first comment. I remember the words exactly because they cut right through the haze of alcohol and laughter. I can see your jugular. I want to bite it. My stomach dropped. Laughter from my friends was still floating around the fire, but it didn't touch me. That sentence didn't feel like a joke. I was ready to leave. I was mentally planning my escape, trying to figure out how to get out of the woods safely without having driven there myself. The guy didn't stop there. At some point, he mentioned he should have brought his chainsaw. My chest tightened. Everyone else shrugged it off, maybe thinking it was humor, but my mind started running scenarios. Terrible ones. I shifted closer to the cooler and one of my friends, putting as much distance as I could between him and myself without making it obvious. The hatchet stayed in my hands, half as reassurance, half as a warning to him if things went wrong. Time passed slowly, each comment from the guy making me more uncomfortable. Every laugh from my friends felt distant, like it was happening in a separate, safer world that I wasn't part of. Then I noticed it. When I reached for a beer, the hatchet was gone. My stomach lurched. I froze, glancing around subtly at first, trying to see where it had gone without drawing attention to my sudden panic. And then I saw him, across the fire, holding the hatchet up like a trophy, smiling at me. "Looking for this?" he said casually, as if it was the funniest thing in the world. That was the moment I decided enough was enough. I whispered to one of my friends that I was leaving and got them to come with me. We packed up quickly, gathering drinks, extinguishing the fire, and moving as silently as possible back to the cars. Every snap of a twig, every rustle in the underbrush made me jump, my pulse racing. The guy didn't follow, at least not visibly, but the threat hung in the air like thick smoke. The drive back was silent except for the low hum of the tires over the gravel. I kept my eyes on the road, checking the mirrors constantly, my grip tight on the wheel. I kept replaying the night in my head, each detail sharper than before. The hatchet, the comments, the casual way he had walked out of the woods. By the time I got home, my hands were shaking, and it took hours before I could even think about sleeping. The next day, everyone else shrugged it off. Nothing happened, they said. He was probably just some weird guy. Didn't mean anything. But I couldn't see it that way. I didn't care about his motives. I didn't care about what my friends thought. I had seen too many horror movies, read too many true stories of bad nights in the woods. A random man, alone, showing up uninvited with alcohol in hand, making those comments, holding a hatchet. There was no ignoring it. I wasn't laughing it off. Not then, not ever. Since that night, I don't go anywhere in the woods late at night unprepared. I carry a knife, a flashlight, a whistle, and I always make sure I have a way out. That experience taught me something important. The woods are unpredictable and people are unpredictable. You can't assume everyone out there is harmless, even if they're smiling and holding a beer. And I've never forgotten that night. The way the firelight flickered across his face, the casual way he held that hatchet, the words that should have been jokes but weren't. I might be white, might be from a safe area, might look like I could shrug it off, but I don't. I never have. I don't hike, I don't camp. I don't sit around fires at night without being completely aware. That night, I learned that horror doesn't come from the movies. It comes from real people, real choices, and the perfect combination of darkness, isolation, and luck.